Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen. Today is episode 8 of The Devil's Brood, The Ransom of a King. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained in the previous episode, Richard and Philip had agreed to go on crusade together, but Richard's decision to break off the decades-long betrothal to Philip's half-sister Alice to marry Berengaria, daughter of the King of Navarre, had transformed the French king from a frenemy into a rival. Although he was officially traveling to Palestine to liberate Jerusalem from the Muslims, Richard seemed to prefer fighting Christians, since he sacked the city of Messina in Sicily and conquered the island of Cyprus. Despite the delay, the arrival of his army ensured the surrender of Acre after a brutal siege of 11 months. However, Richard found himself the sole commander of the Crusader army when a near-fatal illness convinced Philip to return to France. Fighting off an endless stream of attacks by Saladin's army, Richard led the Crusaders towards Jerusalem, but finally realized that he could not retake the city, so he negotiated a treaty where Muslims and Christians would have free entry to each other's lands. Having settled the peace agreement, Richard could finally sail for home. An unintended consequence of the Third Crusade was that most of Philip's rivals had died. Two of his uncles, the Counts of Blois and Sancerre, died during the siege of Acre and were succeeded by young sons, while the third uncle, Count Henry of Champagne, became king of Jerusalem. The Third Crusade also claimed the lives of Emperor Frederick Barbarossa and his son, the Duke of Swabia, which left Germany preoccupied with the succession, unable to threaten the northern borders of France. Furthermore, Count Philip of Flanders had died of Acre, so Flanders went to his brother-in-law, Count Baldwin of Hainaut, an ally of the King of France. And Philip had inherited the county of Artois, gaining control over the eastern border of Normandy. Therefore, Philip returned to a Europe where he was suddenly the dominant power, and he clearly planned to make the most of the situation by invading Richard's lands. It may seem strange that Philip ended his alliance with Richard so easily, but he had aided Richard against the old king because it had suited his interests to divide the Angevin Dynasty. When Richard forged a marriage alliance with Navarre to protect the southern border of Aquitaine, it indicated that he would pursue goals that would prevent the expansion of Capetian territory. Philip naturally saw John as a very attractive potential partner, and the feeling was mutual. In fact, he probably would have immediately joined Philip, but his mother wouldn't let him. Landing in England on February 11th, 1192, Eleanor quickly met with the major lords and convinced John to stay at home. Faced with an expansionist France and a restless John, Eleanor waited anxiously for news of Richard's arrival. However, the months passed and there was no news, even though other crusaders had already returned. Finally, early in January 1193, she learned that Richard was the prisoner of Duke Leopold of Austria. So, how exactly did Richard go from the commander of a mighty crusader army to the prisoner of the ruler of a minor European territory? Well, it did take a lot of work. To be fair, the return trip home would not be a simple matter. It was impossible to reach the Atlantic since both sides of the Straits of Gibraltar were held by Muslims. In theory, Richard would simply retrace his original route, but that had become difficult since he had made many enemies among the nobility of Europe. Aside from deposing the King of Cyprus, the Count of Toulouse was still an enemy, and he had allied with the kings of Aragon and Catalonia, denying Richard a safe landing along the Spanish coast and the southern coast of France. Landing at Corfu, Richard learned that King Henry of Germany had threatened to seize him if he traveled through German lands. A route through Italy was ruled out because Genoa was allied to Germany, while the rulers of Piedmont believed that Richard had arranged for the murder of their relative Conrad of Montferrat. Richard sent most of his men home on their own and sailed with just 20 companions to avoid attention. He hoped to go through Hungary, whose ruler was feuding with Duke Leopold, to reach Saxony, Bohemia, or northeast Germany, territories friendly to him. The German king's opposition to Richard seems to have been based on a temporary alliance with Philip and anger that Richard had signed a treaty with his rival Tancred of Sicily. However, Duke Leopold of Austria is easy to understand. Arriving in Palestine earlier than Philip and Richard, Leopold found himself the leader of the German contingent following the death of Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. When the garrison of Acre finally surrendered, Leopold had placed his banner in the city alongside those of Richard and Philip's to claim a share in the plunder. But Richard responded to a minor duke's attempt to claim equal status with him by angrily tearing down the banner. While Richard could have been more diplomatic, the decision to rip down Leopold's banner reflected his inability to comprehend a genuine frustration among many crusaders. Richard and Philip had showed up late and taken all of the credit as well as all of the plunder. The crusaders who had arrived earlier were understandably resentful since they had spent blood and money on the siege, but were denied any reward. In fact, Richard's actions throughout the journey to Palestine had demonstrated a complete contempt for any other authority, and he faced the consequences of that contempt during his journey home. The stormy Adriatic forced Richard to land and travel by foot with a handful of companions. They attracted attention because they claimed to be humble pilgrims, but spent too much and lived too well. Even in the time before cameras, Richard was famous, so he was captured a few days before Christmas. Despite later legends that Richard was discovered by a faithful minstrel, Leopold soon sent Richard to his lord, King Henry of Germany, who happily spread the news that he held King Richard of England for ransom. Actually, Richard's capture was a miracle for Henry. Although he was king of Germany, his authority was limited since he was merely the greatest of the German princes, and his attempts to rule as a king, rather than forged consensus, had provoked two separate rebellions. Richard's ransom would undoubtedly set new records, and the wagon loads of silver would enable Henry to buy his way out of the mess he had gotten himself into. Leopold knew Richard's value, so 6 weeks of negotiation were required to set a price. The ransom of 100,000 marks would be split equally between Henry and Leopold, although officially it was an extremely generous dowry for Richard's niece Eleanor of Brittany, who was marrying a son of Leopold. Lacking any trust in Henry, Leopold demanded hostages from the German king to ensure that he did not keep all of the money. The German king knew that he had no excuse to hold the English king prisoner since Richard had committed no crime and their kingdoms were not at war. So he held a trial where Richard was accused of conspiring with Saladin to sabotage the crusade, thus diffusing criticism from the Pope for arresting a returning crusader. Learning of his brother's capture, John promptly crossed the channel to meet with Philip. Although disappointed by the stubborn loyalty of the barons of Normandy, he quickly forged an alliance with Philip, who offered the still available Alice and all of Richard's domains. The Scottish King William the Lion refused an offer of alliance, either out of loyalty to Richard, or more likely a shrewd evaluation of John's probable failure against his formidable mother, William's former ally in the Great Revolt. Overly optimistic about his chances of seizing the throne, John hired Flemish mercenaries and returned to England, but when the first of his mercenaries reached England, they were either killed or imprisoned, so the rest returned home. However, John was still too powerful to be imprisoned, and if Richard was never released, he would become king. So Eleanor arranged a truce, promising to return his castles if Richard was not released within a certain period of time. However, the long-term prospect was grim. Although Richard's deputies in each region were able to put down local revolts, none had the authority needed to pull in forces from all over the Angevin Federation and directly oppose a powerful French army, which motivated lords on the border to reconsider their loyalties. Since several border castles had fallen because their lords believed that Richard would remain a prisoner forever, Philip knew the best way to ensure that happened was to give Henry a better offer. Aware of the growing likelihood of spending the rest of his life in a moderately comfortable stone room inside a castle, Richard threw himself into arranging a truce between Henry and the rebels on the lower Rhineland who had economic ties with England and Normandy. A grateful Henry rejected Philip's offer and cancelled the requirement for Richard to support an invasion of Sicily. To be honest, Henry knew that if Richard was Philip's prisoner, then the French king could expand his territory, and he had little interest in helping a rival become stronger. Actually, Philip was preoccupied with internal matters caused by the mishandling of his most recent marriage. Since his wife, Isabella of Hainaut, had died in childbirth in 1190, and he only had a single son, Louis, Philip decided to remarry and chose Ingeborg, the sister of King Canute of Denmark. Although it is unclear why he chose a marriage alliance with Denmark. The idea that he wanted the Danish fleet for an invasion of England makes little sense since King Canute had refused to attach the Danish army and fleet to any French plans. Regardless of the original reason, the marriage did not go as planned. Philip met and married Ingeborg on August 15, 1193, and announced after the coronation the next day that he wanted an annulment. Hoping to forget her existence and remarry, Philip tried to send her home, but she refused to be returned like an unwanted Christmas present. Instead, the Danish princess appealed to the Pope. Unsurprisingly, this harsh treatment did not encourage other kings to marry their daughters to Philip, but Count William of Geneva was convinced to marry his daughter Margaret to Philip in 1195. However, Margaret's party was ambushed by Thomas, Count of Savoy, and she became his wife through the assistance of a pliable priest who was not overly concerned about consent. Eventually, Philip married Agnes de Meran in June 1196, daughter of a noble in the Rhineland, an embarrassing come-down for one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. The ransom of 100,000 marks was 3 times the annual budget of the English government, which must have been a huge financial burden on the kingdom following the tax for the crusade. A 25% tax on income and anything that moved was levied throughout Richard's lands. While much of the ransom was raised on the continent, the greater portion came from England due to its more efficient tax collection system. Clearly, John was not popular since merchants, monasteries, and barons all paid the tax rather than back John. Even so, it took 6 months to gather the ransom. When Philip learned that Richard would soon be released, he sent a message to John. "Look to yourself. The devil is loosed." John did just that and fled to Paris. Unable to stop plotting, he wrote to numerous barons seeking support until an exasperated Eleanor convinced the Regency Council to confiscate his estates. Henry proved to have astonishing luck. Aside from a massive pile of silver falling into his lap in the form of Richard, Tancred of Sicily, his main rival, died on February 20th, 1194. Marching across the Alps with silver weighing down his wagons, he was crowned King of Sicily on November 22nd. While Leopold was excommunicated for imprisoning a crusader, Henry was spared this punishment, likely because he had a very large army that was very close to Rome. Richard was released on February 4th, 1194, after 14 months in captivity. After journeying through the Angevin lands on the continent, he returned to England, where he was greeted with surprising warmth despite the gargantuan ransom, likely because the alternative was John. Once in England, Richard re-established control, helped by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Hubert Walter. Responding to Richard's demands for money to fund his campaign to evict Philip from Normandy, Archbishop Walter ensured that the royal government became more efficient, continuing the efforts of Richard's father to have the crown replace baronial authority. Clearly, both England and Normandy had become wealthy because Richard was able to squeeze a massive ransom and then the money for a huge military campaign within a couple of years without provoking a revolt. Realizing that the traditional feudal army with short periods of service would not be sufficient for the long campaign, Richard required knights to serve for a year recruited professional soldiers from Wales and hired mercenaries. Everyone was paid and paid well. There were two types of mercenaries, Genoese crossbowmen and Brabacons or routiers, hard, ruthless men recruited by famous mercenary captains like Mercadier and Gerard de Athe. The routiers were famous for savagery, rape, and looting, but Richard viewed Philip's Norman allies as traitors, so the poor farmers and residents of towns in those areas would suffer greatly during this war. Philip's position deteriorated rapidly once Richard arrived in mid-May 1194, since John promptly switched sides. When John threw himself at Richard's feet, Richard gave his 26-year-old brother the kiss of peace and said, "Think no more of it, John. You are but a child, and were left to evil counselors. Your advisors shall pay for this. Now, come and have something to eat." Admittedly, a little demeaning, but better than the alternatives of execution or imprisonment. It is impossible to believe that a hard man like Richard could be fooled by John, so he likely forgave him out of family loyalty, encouraged by Eleanor, who probably wanted to ensure that her remaining son would succeed Richard if anything happened to him, since he had failed to produce a child. Honestly, there was no other reason to forgive John. He lacked ability and had few loyal followers. Determined to prove his loyalty, John committed a horrible act. Returning to his base at Evreux, he lured the main French commanders to dinner, where they were murdered before executing all of the French citizens in the town. A furious Philip abandoned the siege at Verneuil and raced to Evreux. Learning that John had fled, Philip unleashed his rage by sacking the city. Recognizing that Richard was in control of the situation, Eleanor remained queen but began living at Fontevraud, not as a nun, but as a guest with her own apartments. Since the abbey was located between Anjou and Poitou, she could keep an eye on those domains, but she was semi-retired since she was in her early 70s. Eleanor apparently had little enthusiasm for either Arthur or John, since she won Richard's permission to make her grandson Otto of Saxony her heir for Aquitaine. Unlike his mother, Richard had made little effort to produce an heir, since he never saw his wife. Although several later chroniclers claimed that Richard was homosexual, the evidence is flimsy, and it is unlikely. Kings spent their lives in the public eye, and there were no references to him having sex with men. No contemporary chroniclers mentioned it, but they frequently stated that lords feared to leave their young sons with Longchamp, who was believed to be gay. Also, Richard did have an acknowledged bastard, Philip of Cognac. Admittedly, Richard did not spend much time with his wife, but that just means he did not particularly care for her, not that he was homosexual. Apparently accepting that he would not produce a son, Richard named his nephew Arthur his heir in 1196 and summoned his sister-in-law Constance. Aware that he resented her semi-independence, Constance left Arthur in safety, wisely because she was abducted by her husband Ranulf of Chester when she entered Normandy, although it is unknown if this was on Richard's orders. Angered by the kidnapping of their duchess, the Breton lords appealed to Philip for aid. Predictably, Richard reacted with violence and fire before finally negotiating a peace with the Breton lords in August, but he refused to release Constance, so more raids followed, but the lords arranged for Arthur to reach safety in Paris. Already busy with other campaigns, Richard finally released Constance as well as pardoned the rebels, but Richard's bungling of the situation had improved John's position as probable heir. Richard had been a good general before the crusade, and now he was an excellent commander. So the campaign soon produced results. After quickly recapturing several fortresses and towns, Richard's army confronted Philip's army in July 1194. Aware that he would most likely lose the battle, Philip retreated, but not fast enough, and Richard captured his baggage train. While Philip could not match Richard's prowess on the battlefield, he proved superior at orchestrating favorable marriage alliances. When his half-sister Alice was finally returned to his not very loving embrace in 1195, he quickly married her to the Count of Ponthieu, whose lands were located between Normandy and Flanders. In addition, Philip had arranged for his vassal Count Renaud of Dampmartin to marry Ida, heiress to the county of Boulogne. As a result, Philip's alliance of Boulogne, Flanders, and Ponthieu threatened the northern border of Normandy. After 2 years filled with a grinding series of raids and counter-raids, punctuated by 2 brief truces to pause for breath, Richard had regained part of his territory. However, the grueling process exhausted even Richard, so he adopted a new approach. I think that the experience of being captured and then ransomed changed Richard. I am not saying that he became a nice person, considerate of other people's feelings, but he acted with more restraint afterwards, or at least with less arrogance, as if months in a moderately comfortable stone room had made him realize that there were limits to his power. Since a civil war had broken out in Spain following the death of Alfonso of Aragon, Richard could no longer use Navarre to check Toulouse. Desperate to break Philip's alliance with Toulouse, Richard was prepared to pay a heavy price. His sister Joan had managed to avoid marriage for several years and may have enjoyed widowhood. Many women did, since it was the only way they were independent. But Richard needed a marriage alliance, and he did not have any children, so Joan was dragged back into service as a marriage pawn. In October 1196, she was married to Raymond VI of Toulouse as part of his peace with Richard, who gave contested territory as a dowry, while Eleanor willed her claim to Toulouse to her daughter, ending a feud that had lasted for decades. Aside from the military perspective, there was little benefit to a conflict between the trading centers of Bordeaux and Toulouse. In a stroke, Richard ended fighting on one front, allowing him to focus on Philip. Displaying a newfound appreciation for diplomacy, Richard turned his attention to Flanders, while Count Baldwin VIII had leaned towards France. His son Baldwin IX, Count of both Flanders and Hainaut, had been raised in the German court, so it was not hard for Richard to lure him with a lot of gold into an alliance against France. Actually, they were natural trade partners, since England produced the wool that was needed by the weaving centers of Bruges and Ypres and Flanders, but trade disputes and tariffs had prevented closer trade. The promise of increased trade convinced Baldwin to sign a new treaty in the summer of 1197. With Flanders on Richard's side, now Philip had to fight on 2 fronts. Other notable lords soon joined Richard, including Count Renaud of Boulogne and Louis of Blois, Philip's cousin. Philip responded by allying with 2 repeat Aquitaine rebels, Aymar of Limoges and Adhemar of Angoulême. While the huge size of the sprawling Angevin territories was impressive on parchment, the Federation simply expanded the length of borders that needed to be defended, while Philip focused on the Vexin, the territory between the key cities of Rouen and Paris, which were only 80 miles apart. Control of the Vexin enabled the Duke of Normandy to threaten Paris, or the King of France to threaten Rouen. However, the residents and the nobles of the region were one people, joined by marriage and trade, but separated by lines drawn arbitrarily on a parchment map by feuding kings driven by their egos, not the concerns of the people who lived there. Rather than navigate the complex interests of the lords in the Duchy of Normandy, Richard, being Richard, constructed the enormous castle of Château Gaillard to anchor control of the Norman part of the Vexin through force. Admittedly, Château Gaillard was a testament to Richard's wealth of experience with sieges and his impressive engineering skills, and it should be, since it cost roughly the entire annual income of Normandy. The castle would serve 2 purposes: block any advances against Rouen, the capital of Normandy, and provide a safe staging ground to attack Philip's castles in the Vexin. While the war against Philip was going in Richard's favor, trouble was brewing with the Pope. Richard had imprisoned the Bishop of Beauvais, who had spread malicious rumors about him during the Crusade, turning many lords in Europe against him. In 1198, Pope Innocent III sent a cardinal to demand the release of the bishop, but Richard responded that the Pope had made no effort to help him when he was a captive and angrily dismissed the cardinal from his court. Aware that this situation would provoke unnecessary conflict, Eleanor arranged for the bishop to escape and offered him sanctuary in her own domains, while officially stating that Richard had freedom. Given Richard's temper, it was a gamble, but it paid off, and the situation was resolved. The death of German Emperor Henry VI in 1197 led to more fighting between rivals for the throne, backed respectively by Philip and Richard. His son was an infant, and the German princes would not accept a child as Holy Roman Emperor. So Eleanor's grandson Otto gave up his right to succeed his grandmother as Duke of Aquitaine in order to become emperor, even though he was a stranger to Germany, having grown up in England and Aquitaine. With Baldwin of Flanders attacking Artois and Richard driving into the French part of the Vexin, it was clear that Philip was losing the war. So a papal legate convinced Richard to accept a 5-year truce. To be honest, genuine peace was unlikely, given the ambitions of Richard and Philip, and the numerous small conflicts that could provide an excuse for war. But something resembling peace, or at least a Cold War, might have developed, except Richard put himself in harm's way once too often. Chalus Castle, an unimportant castle with 40 defenders, was being besieged by his men, and Richard took time out of his busy schedule of running a huge federation of loosely connected territories to supervise the proceedings because he lived for war. Venturing close to the lines after supper, he was wounded by a crossbow bolt. Surgery was needed to remove the bolt. It was done by torchlight, and the wound festered until he died on April 6, 1199. Chalus Castle was located near Limoges in Aquitaine, as if Richard's oldest enemies had finally gained revenge for their many defeats. Richard's death must have seemed like a miracle to the French, and instantly transformed the political situation in Europe. Richard's leadership had rejuvenated the Angevin Federation, and the truce with Philip was essentially a personal truce between the two men. To make matters worse, Richard had not made arrangements for his succession, which was further complicated by the fact that he had inherited the entire Angevin Federation as a whole. Before Richard, Anjou, Aquitaine, and the Anglo-Norman kingdom might have gone to different heirs. The two main candidates were John and Arthur of Brittany. Richard had previously leaned towards Arthur, but had likely chosen John when he was dying. Neither candidate was an obvious choice. Arthur was young, but John had conspired and plotted with Philip to overthrow Richard while he was imprisoned. The debate over Richard's succession would depend on barons across the Federation, and I will discuss that succession during the next episode. Thanks for listening.